Okay, so yesterday we just saw the Mishnah. The Mishnah had told us that if the entire carcass of the Korban Pesach becomes tameh, so then a person has to burn the carcass. You can't use it, obviously, so you have to burn it on Har HaBayis, and you get to use the Atzei HaMarocha, you get to use the firewood that is stored by the Beis HaMikdash. If a portion of it becomes tameh, so you've already started to consume it or to dismember it, and then a portion of it becomes tameh, or if you have leftover Korban Pesach, because you've already brought it back to your home, you've eaten it, you have leftover, so then you can't take it back to the Har HaBayis and burn it there and use the wood of the Beis HaMikdash. You're supposed to burn it at home. And then the Mishnah says that Hatseikanim, but people who were miserly would bring it back to the Beis HaMikdash, they would bring it back to the Har HaBayis, and they did so because they wanted to mooch off of the wood from the Beis HaMikdash. So it sounds like from the Mishnah, it's not that you're not allowed to bring it back. You can bring it back if you want to. We just don't require you to schlep back to the Har HaBayis if you don't want to. But I guess if you want to mooch off of the wood of the Beis HaMikdash, that was your prerogative. Obviously, as we'll see in just a moment, there was another reason why it wasn't desirable to do so, because people are going to see, hey, this guy is he's got leftover Korban Pesach. Why wasn't he careful with it, and why does he have leftover? So the Gemara now says, my taima. So, thanks, Bob. What's the reason why we have this halacha that you have to burn it publicly on the Har HaBayis if the whole carcass becomes tameh? So, Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina Kedei Levaishan. It's a busha, because you want to let people, in other words, these people were reckless, and they allowed an entire carcass of the Paschal lamb to become tameh. So we want to make an example out of these people. Say, look, this is not acceptable behavior. You got to be careful next time. So that's why we did it publicly. Nitma miuta, but if only a portion of it becomes tameh, or a minhu. So now let's raise a contradiction. It seems from this section, from this part of the Mishnah, that you burn it at home if you want to. The contradiction is v'chein mishiyatza miYerushalayim v'niskar sheyesh biyado basar kodesh, that if a person leaves Jerusalem and you're not allowed to take any kachim, even kachim kalim, even the lighter form of kachim is not allowed to go outside of Yerushalayim. So you've already walked outside Yerushalayim and you realize, I've got basar kachim in my pocket. Im avar tzofim sorfu b'mekomo. So if you've already gone so far that you can no longer see the Har HaBayis, you've already completely left Yerushalayim to the point where it's no longer visible, the Temple Mount, so then we don't require you to schlep all the way back, and you can burn it where you are. But if you're close enough that you can still see Har HaBayis from where you're standing, then you have to schlep all the way back to Har HaBayis and burn it using the wood of the temple. What you see from here is that even when you have a portion of the carcass, you just have like a little piece of meat in your pocket, you still have to schlep back to the Har HaBayis. And our Mishnah says that when you only have a portion of the carcass, you can burn it at home. You burn it where you are. So how do you reconcile the contradiction? Amar of Chama bar Ukvalo kasher kan ba'achsenoi kan ba'balabayis. The answer is that one is talking about a guest and one is talking about a homeowner. And the way Rashi explains it is that a guest is someone who doesn't have readily available wood in his own backyard, and therefore we tell him, listen, since you don't have readily available wood, so you might as well, where are you going to burn it? Go all the way back to Har HaBayis and burn it there. But if you're a balabas and you have wood available to you, so then there's no reason for you to have to schlep all the way back. Go burn it in your backyard. So that's the distinction between the two. Okay, so Rav Papa Amar Hava Haba Achsenoi Kan Shehechzik B'derech Kan Shelo Hechzik B'derech. Rav Papa has a different approach. He says that both our Mishnah and the Brisa are talking about where you're a guest and you don't have readily available wood. But what's the difference between the two? So the way Rashi explains it, Shehechzik B'derech is you've already started on your path, on your trajectory towards going back to your destination, which is where you live outside of Yerushalayim. And therefore Rashi says, Lo hitrichuhu lechazer al eitzim. We don't force you to find your own wood. Now, when you're a traveler and you're a guest in Yerushalayim, it's probably going to be a little bit more difficult for you to find your own firewood and for us to require you to burn it yourself at your own expense, at your own fuel expense. So therefore, we give you the option. It's sort of like a leniency that we allow you to come back to Har HaBayis and burn it there. But if you're someone, and the reason that we give you that leniency is because, look, you've already started along your path, you're on your way home. It's such a burden to have to make you go out and find wood. It's going to take you so much more time, and it's going to take you away from getting back to your home in a timely fashion. So therefore, we just allow you just go back to Harabais and burn it there. But if you're not a homeowner, you don't live in Yerushalayim, and you're still on vacation, so to speak, and you haven't yet started to return back home, so you have an extra day, you have a few hours. So there we say, no, go find the wood yourself and burn it where you are. And so it's more of a burden to have to find the wood yourself. So Rav Zvid Amar la'olam kid Amar meikara kan ba'achsanai kan b'balabais. Rav Zvid says, I agree more with Rav Chama, that the distinction between the Mishnah and the Brisa is that the Mishnah is talking about a homeowner, where we say you can burn it in your home, and the Achsanai is where the Brisa says, no, we give you the liberty of burning it in the Harabayas, using the Harabayas as wood. The Afal Gavdalo Hechzik B'derech, and that would be true even if you're still on vacation and you haven't yet started your journey back. We still give you the option and the sort of like the convenience of burning it at the Harabayas where wood is readily available. And the reason is Achsanai Kaven Delesle Asuhu Kitsei Kanin. And the reason is because since you're a traveler and you don't live here and you don't have your own shed of wood in Yerushalayim readily available, so we make you no worse off than the miserly people. If we give miserly people the option of burning a portion of a carbon on the Har HaBayis and to utilize the wood of the Beis HaMikdash, we'll give this guy also. After all, he's not being miserly, it's just that he doesn't have it readily available. So why should we penalize him any more than the miserly people? As we learned in our Mishnah, we give miserly people the option, so we should give this guy the option as well. Okay. Tana Rabbana. So the Brisa now says, Bo l'sarfo b'chatzrosein u'me'atzei ha'maracha ein shomin lo, lifnei habira u'me'atzei atzman ein shomin lohen. Okay, so there are two cases which we don't allow. Number one case is that if a person wants to take the wood from the Beis HaMikdash and bring it home with him to burn the Korban Pesach in his home, that we don't allow. And conversely, if a person wants to bring his own firewood and bring it to the Har HaBayis to burn the Korban Pesach there, that we also don't permit. So Bishlam me'atzei hamaracha b'chatzrosehen ein shomin lahen dilma paishon minayu v'asubu lidei takola. Well, the first case I clearly understand. We wouldn't want you to take wood from the Beis HaMikdash, bring it to your home, and burn the Korban Pesach, even though what you're doing is not illegal, but maybe you'll have leftover wood, and with the leftover wood you may use it for personal use, and that we certainly don't want to happen. Rashi says it's not me'ila, because me'ila, the Chachamim placed a special status on the firewood that it's not subject to me'ila. But it's still a bizayon. It's still a desecration of temple property to use it for personal use. So that for sure we can understand. Ela lifnei habira me'atzei atzman, my time alo. But what's wrong with, after all, you're basically saying, I don't want to be a grubber. I don't want to take from the Beis HaMikdash. I'd rather take my own firewood and burn it in the Har HaBayis. That you would think that would be a virtuous thing to do. So Rav Yosef Omar Shelo Levayish es Misha Ein Lo. Rav Yosef says, what a beautiful concept. He says, so as not to embarrass a person who doesn't have his own firewood. Now this is very interesting because there's a certain irony here. Who's burning their Korban Pesach on the Har HaBayis? It's usually the people who were negligent and allowed an entire carcass to become tameh. And so the Gemara had said, we dafka want to embarrass them and put them to shame because they were reckless and they allowed their Korban Pesach to become tameh. And yet at the same time, we're still concerned about their honor so as not to embarrass them excessively. In other words, make an example out of them. Don't do like this guy who made his Korban Pesach tameh. But at the same time, if he can't afford his own firewood, don't shine the spotlight on him by you bringing your own wood that you could afford to demonstrate that he can't afford it. Isn't that there's a certain sensitivity here, even for people who were negligent and sinful, that deserve to be embarrassed, but don't embarrass them too much. Okay? So that's one explanation. Rava Omar mipnei hachashad. Rabbi says, I have a totally different reason. It's not because of not to embarrass, but rather because of bringing suspicion on yourself. Now, what's the suspicion? You're bringing your own firewood, and then after you burn your korban pesach, whether it's a portion or a whole carcass, you have leftover wood. So you're going to pick it up and schlep it back home with you. People will say, hey, look at this guy. He's taking temple property, he's taking it home with him. So that's what we want to avoid, is the suspicion. My benai uika benai. What's the difference? Is from a practical standpoint, whether the issue is not embarrassing or avoiding suspicion. The Gemara answer is the Isi kone v'charyusa de lechazi l'ma'aracha. Let's say a person were to bring from his own home, he were to bring a certain kind of fuel that is not in any way resembling the firewood of the temple. He brings small sticks or he brings palm fronds to use to burn the korban pesach. So in that situation, if the concern is to avoid suspicion, yes, you're avoiding suspicion, because if you pick up the excess and take it home with you, no one's going to suspect you of taking temple property home with you. But if the issue is not to embarrass the guy who can't afford his own fuel, the problem is still there. Tanan Hasam. Rosh HaMamad Haya. Now, the purpose, Rashi says, of bringing this next Mishnah, even though this next Mishnah has nothing to do with Korban Pesach, is because we have the same idea of two opinions, two Amoraim. This is actually the same Amoraim, Rav Yosef and Rava, who argue about whether the issue at hand is chashad or whether it's busha, right? Whether it's avoiding suspicion or whether avoiding embarrassing someone. Rosh HaMaimad HaYamamid es HaTimein al Shar HaMizrach. The Mishnah says that when you're a Kohen, you have a shift 2 weeks out of the year. So when it's your shift, if, God forbid, you were Tameh during your shift, you still had to show up for work, you still had to come to the Beis HaMikdash, and the Kohen Gadol, or the head of the Maimad, the head of the shift, would make you stand at the eastern gate, at the entrance to the temple, so that people could see you. Right? Even though you're not working that day because you can't come in, but you had to stand outside the temple on the eastern gate. So what's the reason? My time. Amar Rav Yosef Kedei Levaishim. So Rav Yosef says it's in order to embarrass them, in order to say, look, what a busha. You only have 2 weeks out of the year that you got to work in the temple, and you were reckless and you didn't protect yourself from becoming tameh. You deserve to be made an example of. And Rava Amar Bibnei HaChashad. And Rava says, no, it's because we want to avoid suspicion from this guy. Because let's say Bob, who's a friend, no, I keep saying Bob, Joe, right? Okay, Joe is a friend of this Kohen, and he's expecting to see his friend, Yankel the Kohen is expecting to see him in the Beis HaMikdash because he knows it's Yankel's shift. So Joe shows up and he can't find Yankel. He's going to say to himself, Yankel, what an oisvarf this Yankel is. He probably has too much work in his office, so he's not coming to the Beis HaMikdash to work to do his kahuna job. So that's going to raise suspicion against the Kohen, they're going to think that he's too busy working, trying to earn a living, than to come to the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore, my beinayu, so what's the difference between the two? Ika beinayu mefaneki inomi de kagadil shishora. The Gemara says there would be two differences in the following two cases. Let's say Yankel the Kohen is a man of leisure, and everyone knows that he doesn't need to work, right? Everyone knows that he's a fancy pants kind of guy. He's got a silver spoon in his mouth and never works a day in his life anyway. So if he doesn't show up in the Beis HaMikdash, no one's going to suspect that the reason he's not showing up is because he's trying to earn a buck for himself. Everyone knows that that's not the concern. But if it's an issue of embarrassing him, to make an example out of him, then he would still have to stand there. And another example is that let's say that Yankel's occupation when he's not working in the Beis HaMikdash is that he's a schlepper, right? He's a bundle schlepper. And everyone knows that people who schlep bundles for a living make very little money and work very, very hard. It's back-breaking labor. And so this is a kind of work that no one would assume that Yankel is going to do in order to pass up working in the Beis HaMikdash for the week. So therefore, in both of those cases, either when the guy's a real a man of leisure or when he's working for low wages and doing really hard labor, in both of those extreme cases, you don't have to worry about chashad. No one's going to suspect that he's back in the office. But you do. But and therefore he wouldn't have to stand at the gate according to that reason. But if the concern is because of busha, because you want to make an example out of him, then he would still have to stand at the eastern gate. Okay.
Rabbi.
Yes.
In that Mishnah, does it deal with the level of, it doesn't give the level of tumah, because you're not supposed to bring tumah to Harabait. So if the korban became tamei, why would you bring it to Harabait? And even if a person could contract
that's a very valid point. We must be talking about a tumah whereby you're still allowed on the Har Habayis with that tumah. There are certain kinds of tumah that you're still allowed on the Har Habayis. Let's say if you have tumas mace, if you came in contact with a corpse, you're still allowed on the Har Habayis. It's only tumas keri or tumas ziva that you're not allowed to go onto the Har Habayis. And tumas sheretz, they say, is the same. I believe they say is the same thing as tumas mace. So you'd still be allowed to come onto the Har Habayis. So I gave a whole shir on this. It's on Kosher Tube as far as going on the Temple Mount Bisman Hazeh. Okay, let's go on to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah says, HaPesach sheyatza o shenitma yisaref miyad. Now we had seen a little bit of this before, somewhere earlier in Pesachim. I don't remember what DAF. But we made a differentiation between when the Korban Pesach has an intrinsic psul, disqualification, versus an extrinsic psul. Okay? So if it has an intrinsic psul, so for example, what would be an intrinsic psul? Either it became tamei, the carcass, or it left Yerushalayim. The carcass was removed out of Yerushalayim. In both of those cases, there is a psul that inheres in the carcass itself, which prevents it from being used or eaten any further. So in that case, because it has an intrinsic psul, you can burn it right away. However, nitma'u haba'olam oshemesu to ubar tsuraso v'yisarif b'shisha asar. If, however, there's an extrinsic psul, which means the carcass itself has not been tainted, but there's another problem, and that is there's no one to eat the Korban Pesach, because the person who it belongs to either himself became tamei or he passed away. In either of those situations, since there's no one to eat the Korban Pesach, but there's no intrinsic psul, so you actually are not allowed to burn it, because there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the carcass. You have to wait until it starts to decompose. You have to wait 24 hours. You have to wait until the following day. And therefore you burn it on the 16th. Why don't you burn it on the 15th, which is the following day? The answer is because you can't burn kudshim that become pasul on Yantif. You have to wait until the 16th before you can burn it. Now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka Omer, Afse Yisarif Miyad Lafi She'ein Lo Ochlan. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka disagrees, and he says it makes no difference whether the psul is intrinsic or extrinsic. Since no one can eat this carcass, you can burn it right away. And we're going to analyze Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka shortly. But first, let's go to the standard halacha. The Gemara now says, Bishlam etamei ksiv habasar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo ye'achel ba'esh yisaref. The Torah says that if flesh of a korban, and here the Torah is talking about any korban, including a shlomim, which is kudshim kalim, if it comes in contact with tumah, then it cannot be eaten and it has to be burnt in a fire. So clearly you see a source to this halacha that when a carcass becomes tamei, it has to be burnt. But how do you know that when a korban leaves its permitted environs, that it also has to be burnt? Now, it's important to get the background of this story. When Nadav and Avihu died, it was on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And it was also at a time when they were dedicating the Mishkan. So it was a very tragic moment because everyone was celebrating the dedication of the Mishkan. And here Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's two sons, had just perished. And so Aaron and his sons, his two remaining sons, had to continue doing the temple, the Mishkan service, because this was a moment of great dedication. And so what happened was, there was one korban that Moshe had instructed them to eat. It was the korban chatas of Rosh Chodesh, and they neglected to eat it, and they instead went ahead and burnt it. Okay, they went ahead.
Surviving.
What's that?
The surviving.
Aaron and his two surviving sons went ahead and burnt this korban chatas instead of eating it. Okay, so Moshe Rabbeinu comes over to Aaron and says, "What's going on? I told you that you were supposed to eat this." And Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Hein luhu va'es dama el hakodesh penima." After all, the blood of this korban was not brought into a holy place on the inside. Now, what do those words mean? Amar lo Moshe li Aharon, madua lo achaltem es hachatas. Why did you not eat the korban chatas? Shema nichnas dama lifnai v'lifnim. Maybe the blood of this korban chatas was mistakenly brought inside the Heichal, in which case the Korban Chatas now becomes puzzle and it deserves to be burned. So Amar Lo Lav. So Aaron says, no, that wasn't the reason why we burnt it. Amar Lo Shema Chutz L'Mechitzasa Yatzasa. So then Moshe says, well, then perhaps you took it outside of the temple. Maybe you took the carcass of the Chatas, maybe it was inadvertently removed outside the Beis HaMikdash, outside of its proper environs. And Amar Lo Lav, B'Kodesh Haisa. And Aaron says, no, it remained in the temple the whole time. Now, where do we see that was part of Moshe's interrogation of Aaron? Rashi says because the word Penima is extraneous. And because the word Penima is extraneous, we use it to say that not only was Moshe questioning Aaron, maybe the blood was taken inside, but also maybe the korban itself was removed outside. So in any event, Amar Lo, Iba Kodesh Haisa, so Moshe says, well, if it was in its proper place the whole time, Vehein Lo Huva Estama La Kodesh Penima, and the blood was not taken into the wrong place, into the Heichal, so then Madua Lo Achaltem Osa. Then why didn't you eat it? That was Moshe's challenge to Aaron. Michlal, so we can infer from this challenge, Di Nafka Inami Ayal Dama Lifnim Basreifi. We see very clearly from this whole back and forth between Moshe and Aaron that if the blood had been taken inside, or if the carcass had been taken outside, then the carcass would have deserved to be burnt immediately. And that's how we know, that's how the Mishnah knows, that if the carcass is taken outside of its proper environs, in this case, the Korban Pesach being taken out of Yerushalayim, it deserves to be burnt right away. So the Gemara now says, but wait a minute. Bishlama nitma goli rachmana b'kodshim kalam kol shekain b'kodshe kodshim. One second. When it comes to the source text that you just provided for me about when something becomes tummy, you burn it right away, there we have a pasuk that's talking about all karbanos, including shlomim, which is kodshim kalam, the lighter form of kodshim, and surely I would apply that to a higher form of kodshim. However, Eliyotze, ashkachan kodshe ha-kodshim, kodshim kalam inolan. But when it comes to the case of when something leaves its environs, you have to burn it. The example that you've provided is with a korban chatas. A korban chatas is kodshe kodshim. It's something that's not allowed to be removed even from the Beis HaMikdash. How do you get off applying that to the korban pesach, which is kodshim kalam and is allowed throughout Yerushalayim? How do you get off to say that I can extrapolate from there to a case of where the carcass is allowed in Yerushalayim, that if I take it out of Yerushalayim, I have to burn it right away? It's not necessarily so. And let me ask you another question. Besu, Hadatanya, we have a brisa that tells us that goes even further than our Mishnah. And it says, Lan dama, nishbach dama, yatsa dama chutz lakloim, that if a person neglected to properly sprinkle the blood and left it over until morning, or if the blood was spilled out and I can't do zrika, or if the blood in any way left the Beis HaMikdash so that disallowed me from doing the zrika, dekaimulan bisreifa. In all of those cases, there too the carcass has to be burnt. Minolan. Where do you know those halachas from? You don't see that from the story of Aaron and Moshe. So the Gemara says you're right. Nafkalan midar Reb Shimon. We have another source. The Tanya, Reb Shimon Omer. It's the brisa of Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon says, Bakodesh ba'esh tisaref. Now here the pasuk says that any chatas whose blood is brought into the Ohel Moed, accidentally the blood is brought into a place where it's not supposed to go. It's brought into the Heichal, so then the carcass of that korban chatas has to be burnt. And so that's the first part. Limed al chatas shesreifasa b'kodesh. So the first part is to tell me that if the chatas becomes disqualified because its blood was brought in the wrong place, then where do you burn that korban chatas? You burn it inside the Beis HaMikdash. Ainli elazu bilvad. Sha'ar pesule kodshe kodshim ve'emuri kodshim kalaminayin. So that only tells me that when the korban became puzzle because you brought the blood in the wrong place. How do you know that other disqualifying conditions of kodshe kodshim and other disqualifying conditions of the innards of kodshim kalim, where they also are not allowed to be taken out of the Beis HaMikdash, how do you know that they too must be burnt in the courtyard of the temple? Talmud Lomar v'chol bakodesh ba'istisar. So therefore, the first part of the pasuk says v'chol chatas, that any chatas, meaning that it's not just this particular korban chatas, but it's all korbanos that are akin to the korban chatas. Then the brisa continues and it says, Ashkechan Kodshe Kodshim. Kodshim Kala Minolan. So that only covers high-level karbanos, which are not allowed to be taken out of the courtyard. How do you know, even by Kodshim Kalam, which are allowed to be taken out of the courtyard but just can't leave Yerushalayim, that if for whatever reason they become puzzle, you have to burn them? So Ella, Kol Pesulo Bakodesh Bisreifa, Loshna Kodshim Kalim, Veloshna Kodshim Kodshe Kodshim, Gemara Gemirila. The Gemara says in the final analysis, it's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. In reality, we're not basing this halacha that you burn kodshim that become puzzle because they've developed an intrinsic psul by being taken out of their environs. It's not based on any pasuk per se. It's based on an oral transmission from Moshe Rabbeinu. It's a tradition, and that's the bottom line. So now the question is, if it's based on an oral tradition, then you don't need any pasuk at all. So taka, that's what the Brisa says. The chatas da'aron mishom ma'aser shahaya kachaya. The only reason why the Torah tells me the story between Moshe and Aaron is to provide us the narrative of what happened, but not to teach us a halacha that was already transmitted without the pasuk. Ulatana devei Rabbi bar Avuha, da amar afilu pigol ton ibur tzura minolan. So now let's go to another opinion. So first of all, we have the opinion of our Mishnah, which says that something that develops an intrinsic psul is burnt right away. This is all derived from the halacha l'Moshe Sinai. But there's another Tana who says that even when something has an intrinsic psul, you have to wait. You have to wait for ibur tzura. You have to wait for it to decompose until the next day. Where does he? And he says that that's true even by pigul, which is the ultimate intrinsic psul. That if a kohen has a machshava, if a kohen has a thought that he's going to be consuming the meat or doing the avoda of this korban at the wrong time, he completely passels the korban. So there, Tana Devei Rabba Bar Avuha says that I hold that even in that case, where there's an intrinsic psul, you have to wait until the corpse, the carcass decomposes before you can burn it. So where does he get that halacha from? So Minalon Yolif Avon Minosar. He has a gzeira shava. The word avon is written by the law of pigul, and the word avon is written by the law of nosar. Nosar is where you have leftover sacrificial meat. There, by definition, it has ibur tzura because it's been left over to the next day. So it's already begun to decompose, and therefore we learn from that gzeira shava that anything that has an intrinsic psul, it has to begin to decompose before you're permitted to burn it.
Is intrinsic meaning the meat itself, isn't it? And extrinsic means it's from time. Isn't that
extrinsic means that the owner of the korban is precluded from eating it.
Oh.
So there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with the korban itself. It's that it can't be eaten. Like, well, as we'll see also, we'll revisit that idea. That's why I'm using the terms intrinsic and extrinsic.
I think it's not the meat. That's what I was interpreting as extrinsic.
Yeah.
It means like time is a problem, as opposed to the meat to be a problem, be tummy.
No. Time is also an intrinsic psul because it inheres in the carcass itself because the machshava inheres in the.
Yeah, I was thinking more tummy. That
right.
Meat would be.
Yeah. Okay. So v'neilef avon mechatas da'aron. So the question that we're asking this Tana is, if you're using a gzeira shava, well, the word avon is also written in the story with Aaron and Moshe, and therefore there was a justification to burn the chatas right away. So why don't we learn from there that even something with an intrinsic psul can be burnt right away? So Amar Lacha chatas the Aaron ki haygavna nami ibur tzura ledoros baya v'hasam hara shah haisa. He says because that case of Aaron was a unique case. Now the Gemara here doesn't describe why or what its uniqueness was and why there was a justification to burn it right away. But according to this Tana, that was the only time, because it was a unique situation, because it was the dedication of the Mishkan, and that's why Aaron felt justified burning it right away. But in all other cases, you have to wait until the carcass decomposes before you begin to burn it. And therefore, you can't apply a gzeira shava to a unique situation, which was only one time in history, when you have the opportunity to make a gzeira shava to something which applies at all times. So now the Gemara says, okay, fine. Hashla de amrinan kol psule de kodesh b'sreifa loshna de kodshe kodshim veloshna kodshim kalim. Can someone turn off the whatever's buzzing, please? So hashla de amrinan kol psule de kodesh b'sreifa loshna de kodshe kodshim veloshna kodshim kalim Gemara gemirila. So now the Gemara says, now that I have this halacha l'Moshe Sinai, this Mosaic tradition that tells me that any time you have something that has an intrinsic psul, you burn it right away, and it makes no difference whether it's kadshe kachim or kachim kalim. So bakodesh bo'es tisaref lamali. So why do I need that pasuk that I cited before in the Brisa if it's based on a halacha l'Moshe Sinai? The Gemara answer is hahumi boile sheserefasa bakodesh. The answer is not to teach me. You need that pasuk not to teach me that you burn it, but to teach me where you burn it. In other words, without that pasuk, I might have thought, okay, the halacha l'Moshe Sinai tells me to burn it right away, but where do you have to burn it? The pasuk tells me you got to burn it inside the Beis Hamikdash itself. Don't take it outside to burn it. Now, and what about the other pasuk that we cited on Amud Aleph, which tells me that any time kadshim touches tuma, you burn it right away. What do you need that pasuk for if it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai? So hahu l'gufei itzterich. I'll tell you why. Because I might have thought that the halacha of burning something right away does not apply to tuma. Why? Salkadaita chamina kol psulei dekodesh kagon lan dama v'nishbach dama v'yatza dama v'nishchata b'layla debisreifa delesnahu b'chulin. I would have thought that all of the other examples of where kachim develops an intrinsic psul, these are things that are unique to kachim. In other words, there's no such thing as if the blood of a chulin animal gets destroyed, that the animal now becomes pasul. That only applies to kachim. There's no such halacha of lina. There's no such halacha of nosar, right? Or that if the animal was slaughtered at night, it becomes pasul. Those are all unique to kachim, and therefore maybe the only time you're allowed to burn it right away is if the psul that occurs to these kachim animals is unique to kachim. Avol nitma de bechul nami mivsel ema hol visavid be uvdu dechol ema lo tiboy sreifa v'tiskele bekvura kamash malan. But the whole phenomenon of tuma applies equally to kachim and to chulin. In other words, chulin is subject to becoming tameh, and kachim is subject to becoming tameh. And therefore, I might have thought that if the psul of the kachim animals, because it came in contact with tuma, since that's a phenomenon that is universal to both kachim and to chulin, then I might have thought that it's not subject to this special halacha of burning it right away. I might have thought that it's sufficient to bury it, and you don't have to burn it. So Kamash Malan the pasuk and says no, even when its psul is something that is a universal kind of phenomenon that is equally applies to both chulin and kachim, you still have to, when it's kachim, have to burn it right away. Okay, let us go on now. Now we're going to analyze the machlokas between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka. If you recall, what was the machlokas? The Tanakama says that when the carcass becomes pasul because the owner has died or the owner has become tameh, then you have to wait for ibur tzur, you have to wait for the carcass to decompose before you burn it. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka disagrees, and he says that you burn it right away, even in that case where the psul is extrinsic, like is that the term that we used. So Amar Rav Yosef, machloke shenitmeu ba'olim achar zrika di ischazoi basar la'achila. Aval nitmeu ba'olim lifnei zrika de lo ischazi basar la'achila divrei hakol yisaref miyad. Rav Yosef makes an interesting statement. He says the only time that there's a machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka in our Mishnah as to whether you have to wait for Ibur Tzura or not is when the owner dies or becomes tameh after the sprinkling of the blood. Because in that situation, the carcass was at one time edible to a person who could eat it. And because since at one time it was usable as a korban pesach, and then it became pasul afterwards through the death of the person, since it was usable and that therefore it doesn't really have an intrinsic psul, then you have to wait for Ibur Tzur according to the Tanakama. But if the owner dies or becomes tameh before you did the Zrika Saddam, such that at no point in the history or in the span of this korban pesach was it ever edible to anyone, so then even the Tanakama would agree to Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka that you can burn it right away, because this is like it's having an intrinsic psul. And the Gemara says, Meisvei, one second, we got to challenge that. Zeha klal kol shepsulo begufo yisarif miyad. B'dam u'v'ba'olim tu'ubar tzuraso v'yetzel beis hasreif. The Brisa says, and actually this was on DAF Lamed Daled, that we learned that there's a general rule that any time that there's an intrinsic psul, you burn it right away, but any time the psul is a result of the loss of the blood, or that the owner has died or has become tameh, so then you have to wait for Ibur Tzura, and then it has to be burnt in a place called the Beis HaSreifa. So Ketani Ba'olim Dum Yedadam. But the language of the Brisa implies that the loss of the blood and the disqualification of the owner are being equated to each other because it puts the two in the same category. Madam lifnei zrika, af ba'olim lifnei zrika. And therefore, just like the loss of the blood takes place before zrika, meaning the blood gets spilled out so I can't do the zrika anymore, so too the loss of the ba'olim, the loss of the owner, takes place before the zrika. So therefore, you can't tell me that just because the owner died before the zrika, that you're allowed to burn it right away. The Brisa says here too, you have to wait for Ibur Tzura. So Ela I itmar hachi itmar. So if Rav Yosef really said anything, he said it as follows: Machlokes shenitma'u ba'olim lefnei zrika, delo ischazi basar la'achila dahavale kipsulo begufo. He says the machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka is only when the owner became tamei or died before the zrika. Because in that situation, the meat was never at any point edible to any individual person, right? And therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, it's tantamount to an intrinsic psul. But the Tanakama disagrees and says it's still extrinsic. Aval nitma'u ba'olim la'achar zrika di ischazi basar la'achila divri akol psulo machmas davar acher ubaya ibur tzura. But if the owner dies or becomes tamei after the sprinkling of the blood, after the zrika, so then even Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka will agree that since at some point this meat was edible to someone, therefore, if the owner dies afterwards, he would agree that you have to wait for Ibur Tzura because it's totally extrinsic to the meat, and therefore even Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka would agree that you have to wait for Ibur Tzura.
Rabbi, is the owner different from the registered participants in the corporate?
No, when we say owner, we mean it's a generic term for anyone who's registered to eat it. So
they all have to die?
They all have to die or become tamei, or sometimes there's only one guy. It could be a small lamb and a really big guy. So that's why we're using the standard example of the owner. Okay? So, what?
No, I was only...
Yeah, okay. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, and Rabbi Yochanan... This is not the same Rabbi Yochanan of the Mishnah. This is Rabbi Yochanan the Amora says, Af la'achar zrika nami machlokas. That no, I hold that this machlokas between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka of our Mishnah is extant both when the owner dies before the zrika and when the owner dies after the zrika. Ve'az Rabbi Yochanan l'taimei. Now Rabbi Yochanan is consistent. How do I know that Rabbi Yochanan is consistent? Do Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka v'Rabbi Nechemya amru davar echad. Because he says that Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka and Rabbi Nechemya say the same thing. They hold up the same position. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka hada amran. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka is, as we said, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it makes no difference whether the owner dies before the zrika or after the zrika. You're allowed to burn it right away. And Rabbi Nechemya maihi. And what is Rabbi Nechemya's statement? The Tanya Rabbi Nechemya omer b'pnei aninus nisr fazu lekach ne'amar ka'ele. Rabbi Nechemya says as follows. Let's go back to the story of Aharon and his sons on the first day of Nisan when they were supposed to eat the korban chatas of Rosh Chodesh. This was, according to Rabbi Nechemya, what Moshe's complaint to them was. This is a chatas of Rosh Chodesh. The chatas of Rosh Chodesh has to be eaten by the Kohanim. Why didn't you eat it? According to Rabbi Nechemya, Aaron's answer to him was, even though it's not explicit in the Torah, is because we're owning him. Moshe Rabbeinu said, but Hashem told me that all of the karbanos that you're dedicating for the Mishkan have to be eaten even though you're an onen, even though you've just lost a very close family member. Aaron's response to him was, that was perhaps only the dictate when you're dealing with the special karbanos that are only meant to be brought on a one-time basis for the dedication of the Mishkan. But a korban like the korban chatas of Rosh Chodesh, which is meant to be done perennially for all perpetuity, the halacha is not that way. The halacha is that when you're an onen, you're not allowed to eat it, and that's why we burnt it. Now, this was Aaron's argument that even though something is supposed to be eaten, you're allowed to burn it right away. Now listen to the logic. You have to sort of think about this for a minute. The Gemara's statement is like this. V'ha aninus ki la'achar zrika havya v'chi istaruf la'alter istaruf. The Gemara's argument is as follows. A person who's an onen is, when a person can't eat a korban because he's an onen, in the case of the korban chatas of Rosh Chodesh, that really is like a situation where the owner of the Korban Pesach dies after Zrika. Now, why is that? So Rashi explains the svar is as follows. A Korban Pesach has to be eaten. If it's not eaten, it's not a kosher korban. A korban chatas that is brought on behalf of the community, it's kosher even if no one eats it. And therefore, having an eater is not absolutely imperative for a korban chatas of Rosh Chodesh as it is for the korban Pesach. So therefore, the argument is as follows, that just like a korban Pesach, where the owner is alive and the meat is edible and it's perfectly kosher, and yet Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka says that when the owner dies, you burn it right away. This is what Rabbi Yochanan is saying that Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka means. Which means, so therefore, so too, if a person is an onain and he can't eat the korban chatas, since this is still kosher meat completely, just like the korban Pesach was completely kosher meat, it's the same principle. And you see, therefore, that Rabbi Yochanan is consistent, and he says that just like the Kohanim who weren't able to eat the korban chatas ba'aninus were justified in burning it right away, so too Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka says that even though the owner was alive at the time of Zrika, since he dies afterwards, there's a justification to burn it right away. The Gemara makes that analogy, and therefore you see that Rabbi Yochanan is l'shitaso, that he's consistent with what he says elsewhere. This is where we'll hold it for today. You all have a wonderful day.